We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much. If there's one way to clear out a room of policy people in or legislative people here in Washington, D.C., it's to bring up a subject like, so what do you think we ought to do about the collapsing empire? Or, how will we handle this after the empire falls? That is not generally the kind of rhetoric that is considered to be the subject of interest of serious people, shall we say. And yet, there's an extensive, ongoing, long standing series of schools of thought about empire, many of which theorize what happens when an empire lasts too long, overextends, and so on. And much of that theorizing suggests that it's not crazy, let's put it that way, not crazy to assume that we might be in just such a period right now. So, here to talk to me about that, and for both of us to talk to you for that matter, is our good friend, Professor Richard Wolff, economist, economic historian, host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV, and so much more. So, first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's always cute that we Richard one another as it happens, but I'm very glad to be here, and this is in my judgment, a super important topic.
Well, I really think so too. And so to kind of set it up and frame it to begin with, we get into a definitional problem, right? The people say, well, we're not if you're talking about the United States of America, we're not an empire because we don't control land outside our own borders, which even from a strictly governmental point of view, not entirely true. We could get to that. It's a very good book about the hidden empire, all the various parts of the world we do control, including parts of Cuba, close to home. So there is that invisible empire in the literal sense. But I wanted to start on this point of definition by I looked up, just to be clear, Oxford English Dictionary, Cambridge Dictionary, Merriam-Webster. The noun empire generally has two definitions. I'll quote from Oxford. One, an extensive group of states or countries under a single supreme authority, formerly an empire, or excuse me, an emperor or empress, as in the Roman Empire, uh, and or, this is part of definition one, a supreme political power over several countries when exercised by a single authority. Now, if we want to get a little more abstract about it, the second definition in all of these places is a large commercial enterprise owned or controlled by one person or group. So I guess let's start with this. If you accept that there are, which I do, that there are forms of control that don't necessarily consist of direct colonial oversight, are we in fact part of an empire right now?
My answer would be an unequivocal yes. We are an empire, and as usual, it seems to me the history is a clue to why it's reasonable for us to think of it that way. And the history goes something like this. It's obviously truncated. We don't have a lot of time. But World War II was a very important marker. If you want to be a little looser, World Wars One and Two, the first half of the 20th century, was a watershed moment because in that period of time, the empires, by the old definition, the Dutch, the British, the French, the German, the Russian, and I could go on, collapsed, were overthrown, fell apart. Britain lost India immediately after the war. They lost Kenya with the Mau Mau Revolution a little bit later. The Portuguese lost their empire in Africa, and on and on and on. So those formal empires, which is the way I would handle it, fell apart. And the history shows us that they didn't fall apart to be replaced by a community of nations that wasn't under the control of one of them, they fell apart for a new form of empire, namely, and by the way, I'm not the originator of this language, an informal empire, where the word empire is held on to because something important is there. The United States replaced Britain, France, Germany, Holland, Belgium, and all of the others. What do I mean? The economic power was concentrated in the United States. That's why the United Nations, the Bretton Woods Conference that sets up the global financial system, all of these things were done in the United States. Since the end of World War II, the United States' military presence globally goes beyond what any other country ever had before or ever had since. We maintain whatever the current number is, 800 military bases around the country, around the world. Nobody had ever done that before. Even at the height of the British Empire, they probably didn't have that many bases for them that the United States maintains now. And so if you put the economics together, if you put the finances, the US dollar is the global currency, the SWIFT system is the global mechanism for moving money. Many commodities, at least until recently, produced outside the United States, sold outside the United States, used the US dollar as the currency for making these exchanges. I could go on, but the position of the United States in a dominant role, everybody knows that. Everybody understands. The whole world functions like that. It's really only academics and people who like to play around with the details without the substance of definitions that would quarrel with it because it doesn't look good. The United States, after all, comes out of a revolt against being part of an empire. The United States broke away from the British Empire. And in modern days, where there's a strong anti-colonial political, ideological movement around the world, it has been convenient, very convenient, for the United States to reduce the obviousness of its empire by continuing to play the game that it is an ambassador of democracy rather than the replacement of the other empires. But I don't think the world is fooled. And I think more than ever right now, with the rise of an alternative regional bloc, by which I mean China and the BRICS, and the possible emergence of still others, Europe is now deciding whether they're going to continue to be the subordinate lapdog of the United States or try to go their own way. Right now, it looks like they're in the lapdog part of that debate, but they're having a lot of trouble. The Europeans are in the worst economic, political, and ideological position in 500 years, if I'm not exaggerating here. So I think we're at a time when it is correct to say the U.S. has an empire, and that empire, like every other empire in human history, ended. So it really isn't a question, once you accept the proposition that we have something like an empire, maybe an informal one, you put qualifying adjectives in front of it, but we have an empire, and therefore the question is not whether. We know the answer to that. Will it end? The answer is yes, unless it's different from every other one, and it will last forever. Only people in the United States State Department think like that, nowhere else. And so the only question is when. And my argument would be, I see more evidence of that now than I ever have at any point in my lifetime.
And before we get to the issue of the survival of this empire, another way to look at it, I think, is if we look at what the functions of a government are and what happens when a government takes control of another piece of territory. Well, what are the primary functions of government? A government controls the economy, issues the currency, controls the political system, and taxes. These are some of the primary functions of a government. If we look at the United States' role around the world in these various areas, you've already mentioned we have a global economy that is primarily, no longer exclusively, but primarily pegged to the United States dollar. So there's already some sort of global influence there. In terms of democracy, I think the problem is not, as some people would say, that we failed to export American democracy. I think the problem is that we have exported American democracy, but with even less of a veneer of true democratic freedom of thought. I think that the people of Pakistan, for example, would be bitterly amused, if they were to be told that they just exercised their democratic rights after the United States instructed the Pakistani military to remove the prime minister and then instructed the government to make sure that Imran Khan's party did not take power despite receiving far more votes than any other power. And that's just the most recent example of this. So, in terms of democratic influence over other countries, in terms of financial influence over other countries, control of their foreign policy, their military behavior, we could argue, I suppose, about which countries are in and out of this informal empire. I would argue that its boundaries aren't stark, but are somewhat cloudy and gray, and maybe on a scale. Some are more completely subservient to this imperial form of control than others. But all in all, I would say uh, empire is a good description. It is a loaded word, but I think that precisely because it is a loaded word, it's a good word to use. What do you think?
I think so. And I think I would even use as evidence the enormous effort made by academics, journalists, politicians in the United States to avoid the word, to avoid it with a scrupulousness that, if I may say so, makes one suspicious. You need Shakespeare. People are protesting a little bit too much. People's silence about this question when it ought to be on their minds. I mean, a few more things. The United States fought a war in Vietnam. Everybody knows the United States did that. That's as far away from the United States as you can get and still be on this planet. What's going on? You're trying to hold on. It's very important that no other country went that distance, to my recollection, to fight a war to hold on, except maybe the British to hold on to the island of Grenada, which is a clear sign of the desperate pantomime of an empire that they're still involved in, that they want to fight a war to hold on to a place that has more sheep than people. And even more important, they lost the war in Vietnam. They were thrown out, and the communist government that they fought took over. Then they lost in Iraq. Then they lost in Afghanistan. They are in the process of losing in Ukraine. This is an empire that has reached the end. It is overextended. It is fighting too many wars at the same time. It's eating up its resources in doing that. It's going into debt. The debt level of the United States is off the chart. I want to remind people that there's one central bank in the world that the whole world watches to get clues about money and interest rates. That's the Federal Reserve here in New York and in Washington and so on. We don't study the Federal Reserve of Norway or the Federal Reserve of Guantanamo, of Guatemala, et cetera, et cetera. It's the American financial system that has the disproportionate power. And I don't want to misstate anything. The United States remains a very strong country, very rich country, very powerful country, all true. But the empire over which it presided is literally dissolving in front of it. I mean, two
The
days ago, 2 days ago, the United States, if I understand correctly, the United States having intervened at every step in the Ukraine war, led by Victoria Nuland, an official in the State Department, who quit 2 days ago. We don't know why. The official statements are the usual mumble bumble of the State Department, had nothing to do with anything. Nobody knows. Then we had immediately following up the announcement that in a horrible military operation of the Israelis against the Palestinians in Gaza, the United States military is about to establish its own port in Gaza to deliver the humanitarian aid that the Israelis either cannot or will not deliver. Uh, that's the behavior of an empire. Granted, it's the behavior of an empire that is becoming weak. Mr. Netanyahu's middle finger to Mr. Biden is another demonstration of weakness. The miscalculation, for example, that the West would impose sanctions. I mean, let's be clear. The West did its maximum, short of nuclear weapons, to defeat the Russians in the Ukraine, and they failed. They failed. Their sanctions didn't work. Why? Because the empire doesn't have the power it once did. And the people who decided on sanctions are the people who can't admit it. They can't see it. So they're doing the same thing, but being surprised that the results are not favorable, but being blocked by ideological blinders from drawing the conclusion the empire is in trouble and we better come up with a new policy designed to cope with a declining empire, because we're done with 100 years or whatever it is of a period when we developed a policy for an ascending empire. You know, the British had the same problem. They decided to try to stop the American Revolution, first in 1776 and again in 1812. Twice the Americans defeated the British, at which point they realized this is not going to work. And we have to come to some live and let live accommodation. That is where the United States is going to end up. It's only a question of whether it's going to try a nuclear war to avoid getting there. And then, of course, the issue becomes moot.
Well, I agree with all of that, but let's kind of take a step back maybe and do a little thinking through of why this might be the reaction, because by most rational standards, uh, what's going on now is illogical. Let me give you one example. This president, Joe Biden, uh, will be the first president in American history, or is in fact already the first president in American history to suggest that he would intervene militarily if China were to move against Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is a separate country, as you well know, has only existed since the 1940s and the Chinese Communist Revolution. The United States has always, Republican and Democrat, kept a hands-off approach to it, informally recognizing Taiwan, trading with Taiwan, but not getting involved in the territorial dispute aspect of it, since China views it as a breakaway province. So now we have the first president in American history uh, seemingly deliberately picking fights with China, provocative actions, Seventh Fleet in the South China Sea, billions more for military buildup against China, which is responding with military buildup of its own. We have and 7 billion more in the bill he's trying to get passed now. So we have that. We have the situation in Israel and Gaza, where as Bibi Netanyahu humiliates him over and over, he's willing to consider building a port in Gaza, but he's willing to airdrop homeopathically small amounts of food for the Gazan people. I think because it's hurting them politically at home, but for whatever reason, and yet still trying to give $14 billion in military aid, including 10 billion in direct weaponry to Israel, still shipping weapons to Israel. These are, by any logical standards, I mean, if you want to get tough with Israel, stop sending the weapons. Why are we? Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, goes to Taiwan. A huge provocation. Why would we be picking all these fights? It reminds me of Richard Nixon's famous phrase, and I wonder if this is an explanation, if they've internalized this. Richard Nixon, who Democrats used to despise, but I suppose they're rehabilitating all the old Republicans now. Richard Nixon said, if when the chip in trying to stay in Vietnam. If when the chips are down, said Nixon, the world's most powerful nation, the United States of America, acts like a pitiful, helpless giant. The forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten free nations and free institutions. Well, we are behaving like a pitiful, helpless giant because we're trying to emulate Nixon, not because. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Yes, I would. I think that's excellent. Let me answer the question in one way. It is irrational unless you enter the mentality. This is
Mm,
what psychologists do. The person dressed like Napoleon muttering at the end of the street makes no sense to the rest of us. But if you do the work of entering into the world as it is experienced by that person, suddenly the gibberish has a logic of its own. Okay, here's my analysis. The Chinese have outmaneuvered the United States as an economic unit. In other words, they are, sorry, excuse me a moment. They are outproducing. I mean, today's figures, BYD is BYD is outproducing the automobile. They are selling cars that are better and cheaper around the world. They're only absent from the United States because a 27.5% tariff is put on them, so they can't come in because they're so much cheaper. It takes that kind of a tariff to make them price-wise uncompetitive. They are already entering Europe and they're disorienting the entire European auto system. So Apple announced that it is in trouble in China because the Apple telephone, the iPhone, is being displaced by, guess what? Huawei Corporation, the very one that was supposed to have been destroyed. What you see in the United States is not so much the helpless giant. It's the giant who has to use other means because the diminution of its position, which rested on being the number one capitalist producer of goods and services around the world, bar none, is gone. The Chinese have equal, they can outproduce the United States, the same commodity at a better price and a better quality. That's why Walmart and Target are filled with Chinese goods. That's why we're on the verge of having an automobile made in China. That's why the highest level of our technology, Apple, Google, Cisco, they're all fighting Chinese competitors that are already outdoing them. So what is left for the United States? What are they going to do? They're driven to do irrational things. Yeah, suddenly Taiwan becomes an issue. You want to hit back at the Chinese. You arrest the daughter of a CEO of the Huawei Corporation in Canada. What? Come on, arrest an executive. Stop it. You're not changing anything by that. That's purely the behavior of somebody who can't do what they want to do and are doing substitute things. The West is doing it. They took the $300 billion of reserves Russia maintains in the West, like many countries do, in Western banks and so forth.
right.
Okay, doing that means you're sending a message, as has been pointed out, to every country in the world. You keep reserves with these people, and when they get into political trouble, they'll snatch them. So maybe you oughtn't to. This is long run, this is incredibly self destructive. But they're desperate. And what are they going to do? They can't stop the Russians. They can't fight the Russians on the ground. Napoleon tried it and lost. Hitler tried it and lost. The United States and other countries tried it after the revolution and lost. Fighting Russia on the ground in conventional warfare, that's a losing proposition, and they know it. But they can't use the nuclear. I'm reminded of what Mao Zedong many years ago did. He waved a paper tiger in the air and said, "Don't worry about the United States. It's a paper tiger." Really wasn't true when he did it, but it is true now. You have the ability to do something which you don't have the ability to do. And the irony is, therefore, you're left with little gestures. Yeah, Taiwan. Who cares? This is the Chinese do because it's their humiliation. So you have a soft spot, you can provoke them. But you can't change what's going on, which is getting more and more obvious. And now I would pull the punch. It's an empire that's declining, and you're not going to change that by these gestures because they're not adequate to the level of problem. But they don't get that because they don't allow themselves to see that it could be an empire declining. That's an impossible taboo subject, so they can't go there. So they're left with what? This little quid pro quo diplomatic games, military games. Look where that's getting you, either in Ukraine or in Gaza. You're going to do more of those. Those for the United States are terrible disasters. The whole world is watching little Russia, $1.5 trillion GDP, being victorious over the military efforts of the United States and its G7 allies, who have together $35 trillion of GDP. It's a 20-to-1 ratio, and they're winning. It's David and Goliath, and that's how the world sees it. This is terrible for the United States' image in the world. And as you put it, Bibi Netanyahu humiliating the president of the United States is another kind of humiliation. These are signs of a system that can't manage the difficulties of being an empire, which are enormous, and which is why most of them in the end can't survive because they have too many problems relative to the resources they bring to solving them. And that's where I think we are. And having two old white men who don't understand really clearly which way is up is not a promising prospect for a solution here.
And I take it by the two old white men, you don't mean you and me.
No,
Uh,
no.
yeah, just to clarify.
Yeah,
I
there are very important differences between and among old white men.
Right, thank you. But which gets us to, I guess, in closing, the question of big question, obviously, but of how one recognizes that an empire is in decline, and that this one in particular might be. And I would start, by pointing out that over the years, there have been theoreticians of the right and the left who have basically explored this issue. Is there a life cycle to an empire? How do you know when an empire is coming to an end? You had Oswald Spengler, who is, a scurrilous character in many ways. He explored this in terms of the death phase of civilizations and so on. You had, what was the guy's name? Sir John Glubb, The Fate of Empires and the Search for Survival, talking about the various generations or stages he thought civilization went through before overextending itself, declining and collapsing. And then, of course, Marxism as socialism has studied, how capitalism evolves into imperialism and internal contradictions, take it down from there, which seems somewhat more, closer to the truth. But having accepted that this is A, an empire that we live in, B, that it's in deep trouble, might make us conclude that it's not only in deep trouble, but in terminal decline?
My response is I'm not really advocating, I mean, I would if I were in such a discussion, that the empire is declining. All I'm asking for is something much more modest, that it is a bizarre phenomenon, given the evidence we have, that there isn't a national conversation about this topic. Let there be debates. That's all I'm asking. Let people argue. Here's evidence why the empire isn't declining. Or maybe here's evidence why we shouldn't use the concept of empire. But I don't get that. I get what's much more revealing psychologically, a refusal, a taboo. It's like saying, oh, sex doesn't matter in my life. Okay, well, I mean, maybe, but I don't believe it. I believe
Right.
what you're doing is something else because it's probably a sign that this is a very big issue in your life. It's just you've never resolved it. I'll give you an example. The other day, in a leading publication I won't mention, there's a long article about how we need master narratives to help us through this difficult time. And then the author, a professor at Harvard, explains that here are two that he finds useful: the struggle for and against democracy, and the struggle for, yeah, exactly, the straw
I
and
made a
the,
face for radio
yes,
listeners. Yeah.
exactly, and the
Yeah.
and the and the forces for and against authoritarianism.
Right.
I love this. These are huge master narratives. They are immense ideas. They don't immediately apply unless you've already decided the good guys who are democratic are over here, the bad guys who are authoritarian are over there, and you're going to organize the world around that. But here's interesting. This is said to be an urgent conversation, not a word in there about an alternative conceptual framework, the rise and fall of empire, which might be applicable in interesting ways to looking at the world. No, no, no. Oh, no, we're not going there because it's clear who's the empire. Even the language used about Russia and China, particularly China these days, that they want to become, when you finish the sentence, what China wants to become, it's usually a description that would fit where the United States has been. The people kind of get it that the Chinese want to be what we have been. And they don't want that, which I understand. But it is a tacit admission that these conceptions of wanting power and global influence are not restricted, presumably, to the Chinese population. They have a broader appeal, do they not? Maybe even to us. Heaven knows. And he did. I find this refusal to engage the conversation is proof to me that we are in fact an empire in decline. We're so far into decline, we dare not even talk about it.
And I
You know, it's
dare say,
Michel Foucault taught us that this refusal to deal honestly and openly with sexuality, to only deal with it indirectly, hidden, secretive, pornographic, by illusion, is not a sign of maturity. It's a sign of immaturity. It's a
right.
sign that you can't handle the honest conversation, but you can't really repress it. So it bubbles up in these perverse forms, but you can never solve the perversity which you claim to be against because you can't dare have the honesty without which you never get over the perversity.
And, as part of this, and I'm tempted to say Ray Foucault, that Ares, god of war, is taking the place of Eros, the god of love, in our sublimation now. But it seems to me too, and I guess this will be my final comment, I'll give you the last word, but that, how do I put this? That Republican voters, for example, who are unlikely to describe themselves as anti-imperialist, are among those, many Democratic voters as well, who intuit that we are an overextended empire and would like to see something different happen. Senator Josh Hawley, right wing Republican, gave 2 minutes of a talk the other day that sounded like, he was speaking at a peace rally about the money going to Ukraine and helping no one, making it worse for them. We could use it at home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That perhaps out of insincerity or what have you, and certainly Republicans are very hawkish on Israel for theological reasons, probably, but that Trump, I would argue, his victory was due in large part to his claiming to have been against the Iraq War. We should stop being involved all around the world. We should take care of working people here at home. I think people get it on some level, but nobody's articulating it for them except in a demagogic way. And I think that is both a challenge and an opportunity for those of us on what I call the real left to start reaching out to them. But that's my last word. What's yours?
Yeah. No, my last word is, look, the capitalist system, I think, left the United States over the last 50 years. The dynamic centers of capitalism were the United States, Western Europe, Japan, and so on. And they have moved. And that should surprise no one. They moved to China and India and Brazil and places like that. And that's where they're bubbling up. They're different from the way they were in Western Europe and North America, because there the government is a major player in a way that it was not allowed to be. That has to do with our feudal backgrounds and so on. We're more laissez-faire. They're more state interventionist. But employer-employee relations in production, the heart of capitalism, they have that there. We have it here. But when capitalism moves, as it always has, when it moved from New England to the Midwest, from it abandoned the Midwest and moved to the Southwest, California, and the Southeast, we know what it left behind. Empty factories, ransacked communities, depressed areas, which are New England and Midwest in many parts. That's what it's doing to the United States. It is undermining not a region of the United States, we've had that, but the whole country. There's nowhere left to go, but they're going out. To Mexico, to Canada, to China, they're gone. And we are left behind. We own it, so the rich can live off of the capitalism overseas by owning shares. But for the mass of people, no access except to crappy jobs, insecure jobs, racked by inflation. The empire is falling apart. And so my appeal is almost to those who don't agree with us.
Right.
You are taking us into very dangerous waters with a delusion about where we are that is even more dangerous than the decline we're actually living through. And if you continue that, the end result is going to be horrible.
And maybe next time we'll talk about how we might make that transition that we're experiencing something positive for working people rather than the
Exactly.
sort of exsanguination of the American working class. But for now, Richard Wolff, as always, thank you so much for your thoughts and thanks so much for coming on the program.
My pleasure, Richard, and thank you very much for creating the opportunity. It's really a wonderful thing to see this kind of conversation play some role in the larger thinking and talking of the American people and the others who watch.
Well, let's keep it going.
All
And we'll be
right.
right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. We urgently need your help here at the Zero Hour to keep the program going. So we would appreciate anything you could do. If you're able to contribute, please go to patreon.com/the Zero Hour or become a paid subscriber of our newsletter at Eskow, ESKOW.substack.com. If you can help, we would very much appreciate it.